Okay, we're back. So how was that meal? Everybody get enough to eat? Yeah, yeah. We want to give special thanks to Schmittsville Restaurant, Flawlessly, for providing that meal for us, especially those desserts. How about the peach pie? That was pretty good. So again, welcome everybody back again. And we're going to move forward with a speaker for this evening. But before we get to that, I wanted to recognize a special person in the room. Mitch McKinney made a super effort to get here from, where did you come from, Mitch? Okay, so he came from a ways away, and he was the person responsible for, and by the way, welcome to those of you who are online right now. Thank you very much for tuning in. How many do we have online right now, Mitch? So at least 9 of our cousins are joining us online. We thank you for joining in. And again, I want to thank Mitch McKinney for his expertise in the IT area that we were able to get that patched in a very short period of time, because I know it was a stretch for him to get here when he did, and he made an extra effort. So I just wanted to recognize that.
Yay.
Also, I wanted to remind everyone that the event registration was for just our costs for the church and the event itself. So if you had a meal, that was, just remember that the meals were a separate fee that was on the website. So just as a reminder, those need to be paid separately in case anyone was not sure about that. Okay, I think that's about it for housekeeping things. So welcome again. My name is Brubacher-Brubaker. For those of you online, again, thanks for being here. Just wanted to remind everyone here in person, information and merchandise tables will be open.
Hang on, I'm sorry.
Tomorrow morning.
That's okay. I was.
Stop by there, and also printed programs.
Yeah, it's a meeting. It's okay.
If you didn't already get them, they're also available at the registration desk. So without further ado, we have some amazing topics and presenters for tonight and tomorrow. Our first session.
And what about the rod?
With our Anabaptist roots, followed by our roots in Switzerland, tracing our origin.
Do we pay for those service calls?
No,
Okay.
And following
And so,
roots in France
and why are
Germany,
you asking me about?
and our genealogy and alphabetized branches of family tree. And the final presentation will be our roots in Pennsylvania. But now it's time for me to introduce our speaker for this evening. The topic is my life story. Part of the exciting life that Daniel has lived includes his research and learning of further connections in the larger Brubacher-Brubaker family that potentially pushes the family record further back in time and connecting 2 large branches of the Brubacher tree, dating back to the early 1500s in Europe. Daniel was a magna cum laude 1987 graduate of Albion College and got his law degree from the University of Michigan Law School in 1992. His legal career kicked off with the law firm Micah, Myers, Beckett, and Jones, PLC. He has been in the Michigan Supreme Court Commissioner's Office since 2003 and named Chief Commissioner in 2012. Daniel and his wife, Tamara Brubaker Salcedo, live in Lowell, Michigan. They have 4 grown children. He has been on the Lowell Area School Board and has served on the Lowell Area Chamber of Commerce. He has also served on the board of the Lowell YMCA, Flat River Outreach Ministries, and the Lowell City Council and Planning Commission. He is active in the Lowell First Methodist Church and the Iglesia Metodista Unida La Nueva Esperanza. Hope I didn't butcher that too badly. I took French in school. I didn't take Spanish. A church that serves the Hispanic community. Dan is also currently affiliated with an organization called The Movement, working with a diverse group of ministers and laypersons to develop a multicultural, multiracial, inclusive church startup in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He also is serving with Refugee Education Center as a board member. Please give a warm Brubaker family welcome to Mr. Daniel C. Brubaker.
That wasn't too bad for a French speaker. I gotta give it to you. Well, thank you very much for inviting me here tonight. Oops, gotta put these on. I noticed before I came up to speak, my wife went back there and grabbed a big cup of coffee, and it was not decaf. So you might want to do the same, just to let you know. It's typically when I'm boring a room full of Brubakers, it's back in Michigan, where I'm from. My wife and I get here to Canada quite a bit. We come in the summers for the Shakespeare Festival in Stratford. We also go, more recently, we've been coming to Niagara on the Lake. There are a few things that we like to do, including the Shaw Festival, and my wife is a big fan of the wineries. I have to say too, I know there's kind of the stereotype of Canadians as being very friendly and warm, and I think some stereotypes are true. That's always been our experience. We felt very welcome here. We enjoy it quite a bit. I grew up in northern Michigan, and I feel like it's kind of the same in a lot of ways. So the advertised title of my speech was kind of my life, but I'm going to focus on the part that's a pretty broad topic. So I'm going to try and focus on the part of my life that I think will be interesting to people, and that is my career with the Michigan Supreme Court. Just by way of background, I graduated from University of Michigan Law School in 1992. For the first 10 years out of law school, I was in a firm with about 50 attorneys in Grand Rapids. In private practice, I was a partner there. I liked private practice, but there were a lot of drawbacks of that. I practiced mostly in litigation and municipal law, and part of that was a lot of night meetings, planning commission meetings, township board meetings. And also, when you're in private practice, there's a huge pressure to develop clients. And so that's some of the organizations that were listed. You got to get your name out there. You got to get known. So it was the Chamber of Commerce, the Rotary Club, the Lions Club. And I was very busy, and I kind of felt like I had 4 kids, and I felt like it wasn't really fair to me. Most evenings I was busy, and I wasn't home enough. And so I started thinking that I might want to do something else. So I was looking for something that I thought would be interesting, but not quite so time consuming. And eventually I saw a posting for what turned out to be my dream job, which was that of the commissioner's office at the state Supreme Court. I was a lawyer, and I didn't know exactly what state Supreme Court commissioners do. So I won't expect any of you to know that either. So I have to give you a little background on the court and the court system to allow you to kind of understand what it is that I do. I'm going to start with a brief history of the Michigan Supreme Court. The Michigan Supreme Court was established before Michigan was a state. Dates back to 1805, when Michigan was just a territory. And it had 3 justices who served indefinite terms. One of those justices in particular is kind of an interesting historical figure, important for Michigan. His name was Augustus Woodward. He was the first attorney to establish the law practice in Detroit. He was appointed by President Thomas Jefferson. And then some of you may know in the War of 1812, Detroit became a British territory that even without firing a shot, Britain managed to capture Detroit. And Woodward was one of the only people who stayed, one of the only attorneys who stayed in order to help his citizens who were then operating under British martial law. After the war, he would go on to help plan the city of Detroit and take part in the creation of the University of Michigan. The court kind of had its heyday between 1865 and 1885. Back then it was regarded as one of the most outstanding state Supreme Courts in the United States. It was kind of at the forefront of the Western states at that time. The court's influence, the decisions that were made back then still influence the law today. If you open up any contracts law book in the United States, at least, you'll find a case called what's referred to as the case of the Barren Cow, which was kind of the very important case for contracts law. And it's some of those old cases. It's interesting how they establish certain fundamental principles of law that still apply today. Jumping forward, we now have 7 justices on the Michigan Supreme Court. They are nominated by political parties, but the justices are elected, but they appear on the nonpartisan portion of the ballot. So for instance, in November, we have a couple of justices who are going to be up for re-election. The Democrats are going to nominate two justices, two people for justices. Republicans will nominate two people for justices, so there will be 4 on the ballot. But you don't know who nominated them because they're on the nonpartisan portion of the ballot. 2 of them will bear the name or will bear an incumbency designation. It's rare when a justice would lose when they're identified as an incumbent. I should go back. One thing that's kind of different about the United States and Canada, in the United States, in the federal system, all the judges and justices are appointed, but the states can either elect or appoint justices. It's up to themselves. I understand in Canada, that's not true. There are almost no elected judges in Canada. Judges are almost always appointed. And I think that's true both at the federal level and at the provincial level. So in order to understand a little bit about what the Michigan Supreme Court does, we've got to go back and explain a little bit about the system as a whole. Everything kind of starts with the lower courts. In Michigan, that would be the district or the circuit courts, and where you are depends on how much is at stake. In a civil case or in a criminal case, it depends on whether you're charged with a misdemeanor or a felony. There are a lot of district courts. Every county has a circuit court, and district courts are, it's kind of like a pyramid where in the lower courts, there are a lot of circuit or district courts. Then there are fewer like Court of Appeals offices, and then you go up to the Supreme Court. It's kind of the same with the federal system, where you have federal district courts, federal circuit courts, and then the U.S. Supreme Court. The lower courts are kind of where the action happens. That's where the excitement is. If you go into a lower court, for instance, or circuit court or district court, you will see a witness stand and a jury and let me back up a second. Witness stand and a jury box. If you go into an appellate courtroom, you don't have those, and that's because in the lower courts, those are the courts that are going to look at the disagreement. They have to figure out what the facts are, and if people are disagreeing about what the facts are, they have to find those facts. They make the determinations to what those facts are, and then they apply the law to those facts. And another difference between Canada and the United States, in the U.S., well, in both U.S. and Canada, if you're charged with a crime, you get a jury trial. But in the U.S., if I sued someone for breach of contract, I could also get a jury trial. In Canada, in a civil case, it's a judge that would be deciding what the facts are and how the law would apply to those facts in the first instance. If you lose your case at the trial court level, so let's say you're convicted of a crime, or you're found responsible for breaching a contract, you can then take your case to the Court of Appeals. The Michigan Court of Appeals was created in 1963. So that's the court that is kind of directly between the lower level courts and the Michigan Supreme Court. A lot of court systems kind of have the same setup where you have 3 levels of courts, lower courts, intermediate appellate court, and then Supreme Court. They have different functions. So in the Court of Appeals, that's what we call an error correcting court. The Court of Appeals kind of looks at what happened at the trial court and determines if there were any mistakes made. And if there were mistakes that were made, the Court of Appeals determines whether they were so prejudicial that you are entitled to a new trial. It's looking specifically at the facts of that case, that individual case, and making a determination that is unique to that individual case. When you get to the next tier of review, which is the 3rd tier or the highest tier in the system, so in Michigan, that'd be the Michigan Supreme Court, or in the federal U.S. system, it would be the U.S. Supreme Court. The job isn't so much to determine if there were errors that were made and to fix them. The job of the highest court is to determine what the law of the state is. So what the justices in our court are fond of saying, when we have attorneys there for oral argument, they'll say to the attorneys, look, I know you care about this. This case is very important to you. And this case is very important to your clients. But for us, it's about the next 100 cases. You know, we're trying to determine what the law is going to be. The rule that's laid down in your case is going to apply to all the lower courts under our jurisdiction, and will apply until it's eventually, either overturned by a new Supreme Court decision, or in certain circumstances, the legislature could change the law. It's not what you call an error correcting court. It's Supreme Court is looking for cases that are jurisprudentially significant and deciding those cases in a way that they think is important for the state as a whole. So I'm going to give you an example to run through the system. So let's say my mom, who is sitting back there, sold me some play tickets to Stratford, and she just said, "Hey, I bought these play tickets. It's to Macbeth. You know, but it turns out I can't go this weekend. Do you want to buy my play tickets from me?" And I say, "Sure." I look at my calendar. I've got the time. I buy the play tickets from her. I drive all the way to Stratford. When I get to the theater, I show the tickets to this nice, probably elderly, gray-haired Canadian woman who's going to take the tickets. She looks at them and she says, "I'm sorry, sir. These are obviously fraudulent. These are fake tickets. I'm not going to call the police, but what we're going to do is we're going to put your picture up in the security office. We don't want you to ever come back to Stratford. And if we see you, we're going to kick you out of here." So at that point, I've got to turn around and I've got to drive all the way back to Grand Rapids with suffering the shame and humiliation of being kicked out of Stratford. And the first thing when I do when I get back to Grand Rapids is I'm going to sue my mom. And I'm going to sue her in the circuit court, but I'm going to sue her for a lot of money. So I would do that by, I initiate the case by filing a complaint. She would file I would allege anything I could think of, breach of contract, fraud. She would file an answer setting forth her affirmative defenses. The most likely one being she's what we call an innocent purchaser for value, meaning she paid money. She didn't know they were fake tickets. She paid money. She purchased the tickets. She gave them to me, essentially saying, like, "Look, son, if you want to sue someone, don't sue me, sue the person who sold me these tickets. I didn't do anything wrong." So at the circuit court, we could depose each other. We could depose witnesses. And eventually, in the United States, we could get to a trial, although it's actually very rare. It's about maybe 5% of cases get to trial. In Canada, it would be, well, in the United States, I could get a jury. In Canada, it would be a judge, who would then determine, who's telling the truth. Assuming we had conflicting stories, the trial court levels where they would determine who's actually telling the truth. And it would take the first stab at applying the law to the facts of that case. Let's say I lost. So then I go to the Michigan Court of Appeals. And what I'd be saying to the Court of Appeals is, please take a look at my case. There were some errors that happened below. Perhaps I got some evidence, or she got some evidence in that I didn't think she should have. And I say that impacted the result, or I needed to get some evidence in. The judge wouldn't let me. I say the fact that I couldn't get this evidence in screwed up my case. And it prejudiced the case. And then, so the Court of Appeals will look at it. And the important thing is the Court of Appeals has to take the case. I get what we call a claim of appeal or appeal of right. So the Court of Appeals is going to look at it and determine what happened in this case. Was everything kosher? If it was, it then affirms the lower court. If I lose again, now I want to go to the Michigan Supreme Court. I have to file what's called an application for leave to appeal, because the Supreme Court doesn't have to take my case. It takes fewer than 20% of the cases that are presented to it. And what I have to do when I'm filing at the Michigan Supreme Court is I have to say, look, you need to look at this case. It's not just important to me and my mom who swindled me with these tickets. It's important to the state as a whole. The Court of Appeals, for instance, might have said something, and I want to tell the Supreme Court what the Court of Appeals said is so bad that it's going to mess up contract law going forward for a lot of different kinds of contracts. So the Supreme Court will review the application for leave to appeal and decide if it's going to grant leave to appeal, reverse it. There's a lot of different things it could do, or just deny leave to appeal. And when it denies leave to appeal, it's not affirming the lower court. It's just saying we're not going to do anything with this case. So I told you all that just to tell you what it is that commissioners do. So commissioners, and I'm not the chief commissioner. There's about 15 commissioners, plus we have some people on a contract basis and support staff. And commissioners, every one of the applications for leave to appeal that gets filed, it's a commissioner report. Pre-COVID, we were averaging around 2,000 or so applications for leave to appeal every year. It's closer. I'm thinking that by the end of this year, it's probably going to be around 1,400. There was a huge slowdown in the circuit courts, in the trial courts, and by the time that it takes about a couple of years for anything that's happening in the circuit courts to make their way up to the Supreme Court. So what we're looking at now is getting the slowdown that occurred over the last couple of years. the commissioners in the court come from a wide variety of backgrounds. You can't be a commissioner right out of law school. You have to have experience. You have to be out at least 7 years from law school. What we look for are people who have practical experience that they can bring to the court so that when they're writing their reports, they can value what it is they're presenting. So we have people who were criminal defense attorneys, we have people who are prosecutors, we have people who are at the Attorney General's office doing elections. We have people who specialize in labor law. We need people who have some area of expertise that they can bring to the court and say and then when they're doing these reports, kind of let the court know what they think the court should do with the case. It's a little bit of a difficult transition going from outside practice to being a commissioner. As a commissioner, you're not advocating for any particular position. As a former prosecutor, you're always emphasizing whatever evidence there was against the defendant and de-emphasizing any evidence the defendant had. But when you get to the court, we're entirely neutral. We have justices who are very conservative. We have justices who are very liberal. And we work with all 7 of them. So all we're doing is saying, here's what we think the law says needs to happen with this case at this time. The commissioners do reports. They're anywhere from 10 to 50 pages or so. They kind of lay out, here's what the appellant says. That's the person who wants us to grant leave to appeal. Here's what the appellee says. The appellee is whoever won at the Court of Appeals. They usually do not want us to take the case. We may have, and we explain what happened at the Court of Appeals. We explain what happened at the lower court. We may have amicus briefs. So an amicus brief is what's called a friend of the court brief. So let's say we have an important, or what looks to be an important case from the Court of Appeals, and the case involves a labor contract or something with Chrysler. We might get Ford and GM filing a brief saying, look, we're not parties to the case, but what the Court of Appeals did was horribly wrong, and if you don't fix it, the sky is going to fall, or vice versa. It's the private sector in particular pays a lot of attention to what we're doing because they know that what we decide in any case could have significant consequences for what they're doing and for the economy of Michigan. In a sense, it's like triage. The reports that are done tell the court, look, this is a potentially important case and you need to pay attention to it. And there's something going on here that we think deserves a closer look. Or we're saying, we think there's really nothing to see here. There's not much you need to do. So my job is, I was a commissioner for 10 years, and then the chief commissioner left, and I was appointed to the chief commissioner position. So I have, there are kind of 2 aspects to my job. The first is I run the office. So, I've got this office of 15 attorneys, and it's like herding cats sometimes. I do everything from training, implementing new procedures. I got to make sure everyone gets updated about the court's cases. I review people's work, general HR matters, that kind of thing. The other part of my job is a little more interesting, and that's that I get to sit with the justices when they're deciding the cases. So the justices have conferences every Wednesday. They have 2 different kinds of conferences, CR conferences, which are commissioner report conferences, and that's where they review the reports that are prepared by our office. And then they have oral argument conferences. So 8 months a year, we have oral arguments, like in September, and we'll have about 10 oral arguments. After oral argument, the justices meet and decide what they're going to do with the cases that have just been argued. So I sit with the justices, not at the same table, but I'm with the justices when they're deciding what to do with these cases. And it's kind of my job to know everything about the case that they might have a question. So I need to review those commissioner reports. I need to know why the commissioner recommended what I'm the face of the office. So I need to know why the commissioner recommended a particular course of action. I need to know about, what the Court of Appeals did. I need to know the procedure. I need to know if we have other cases out there that might be impacted by the case that they're reviewing. I'm just a resource for the justices. So if they have questions about anything, they can ask me. The other thing that we do is that if the justices, there's a lot of different things that they might do with the case. If they decide to write an opinion, which would usually be after oral argument, then that gets assigned to a justice. But that's probably only about like 5% of our cases. If they decide to do anything else, it will be done via an order, and that order goes to the commissioner's office. So they might, for instance, look at a Court of Appeals decision and say, there are 3 judges on Court of Appeals panels. They might say, and let's say one judge dissented, and they might say they agree with the dissent. So they might say, we need an order that reverses the Court of Appeals for the reasons stated by the dissenting judge, and then it remands to the trial court to do X, Y, Z. So that goes through our office. So we would work on that order, maybe with working with the justice or justice's clerk. And then everything then gets recirculated to the justices. They're the ones who have the final say on everything, and all 7 need to approve anything before it goes out. So it's really interesting. It can be a little stressful at times because you never want to be in a situation where a justice asks a question and you just say, that's a good question, Justice. I'm going to have to think about that. I need to be prepared as I go in there. Although occasionally I do have to say, you know what, that's a really good question. I don't know. Let me go find out and I'll get back to you. Lately, what's happened, I think because of the political situation and kind of where Michigan is as kind of a purple state, we've been getting a lot of election emergencies. There have always been election emergencies, but not like we've seen lately. So a huge part of my job lately has been dealing with the cases that no one likes because election emergencies get filed. Typically, you have to act on them very quickly, and they're very important cases, but you just don't have the time. A normal case might take 8 months or more to kind of go through the process. You might get an election emergency where someone needs a decision in 2 weeks. After the 2020 elections, we had numerous challenges to the presidential vote count. So we got all those cases. More recently, so last Tuesday, we just had our primary election in Michigan. And some of it may have hit national news, I don't know, but we had, so we have a Democratic governor. There were 10 people on the Republican side who wanted to run against our Democratic governor. So they needed to file nominating petitions containing signatures. There 10 gubernatorial candidates collected enough signatures, but what's happened is it's become harder and harder to collect signatures. Used to be you could get volunteers to do it. Now nobody wants to do that, and you have to get a lot of signatures. So there are companies out there that get your signatures for you, and because of COVID and the labor market, the price per signature, this is a little bit anecdotal, but it's gone from like $5 a signature to $20 a signature. And you have to get thousands and thousands of signatures. So this is kind of an area that where you could see where there might be a temptation to commit fraud. And that is what was allegedly happening according to the Secretary of State. There was a company that was supposed to be collecting signatures, and they were just, one person would write 20 different names, and they were doing all kinds of things. And so the Secretary of State, after their investigation, determined that 5 of the 10 gubernatorial candidates had not actually submitted a sufficient number of signatures because of the fraud, and kicked them off the ballot. And it turns out that wasn't just the gubernatorial candidates, there were candidates for local office as well, who had used this company. And so a lot of people were getting kicked off the primary ballot. And all this was happening shortly before the ballots had to be printed. And that's a kind of a hard deadline. When you're looking at sending ballots out under federal law, ballots have to be sent out 45 days before the election to people serving overseas. So we had to move very quickly. So my job, like as chief commissioner, and in general, not just in these cases, but in general, is I kind of have to shepherd the cases through the system. When they come in, I assign them. I then work with commissioners on getting them prepared. So in these emergency cases, what I had to do, so I work in Lansing at the Hall of Justice. By the way, if anyone ever comes to Lansing and you want to tour the Michigan Supreme Court, look me up. You can find my contact information. I'll give you a personal tour. So part of my job there in Lansing is to kind of keep abreast of the news and know what's going on. So fortunately, I had seen some reports that something of this magnitude might happen. So even before anything was filed, I started gathering our election team together. We had to start talking about what might we get? What might it look like? How quickly are we going to have to decide anything if it gets filed? What theories are they likely to allege would justify, getting them on the ballot despite having these fraudulent signatures? So I do that ahead of time. I work very closely with the Chief Justice because she is the administrator of the entire court system. And so I work with her on figuring out how are we going to get these reports done, get the reports in front of the justices and get decisions in time so that the ballots can be printed with finality, because once the ballot goes out, it's really hard to say that somebody's votes aren't going to count. And in that instance, we ultimately had 10 cases filed, and we had to decide them all within like 2 or 3 weeks. Well, it was kind of like being right back in private practice. There's a lot of weeknights and weekends. I was here at Stratford one time, and when I wasn't at the place, I had my laptop open and I was kind of working on figuring out what we were going to do with these cases. The other thing that slows them down is every justice has the ability to write a statement in any case. So any justice can say, well, we're going to deny leave to appeal in this case. I want a statement saying if it was up to me, I would have granted leave to appeal and I would have done X, Y, and Z. And then another justice can say, well, if you're going to say that, I want to say this. And so you have to allow the justices time to have statements, competing statements, and revisions going back and forth. So there's a lot that goes into that. And frankly, I think that trend is not going to go away right away, I think. So it's not the funnest thing in the world, but the election cases are going to be here to stay, I think, for a little while. Just a real quick word on why I like working for the court system. And people kind of forget about this, but at their core, courts are the means by which we maintain civilized society. They are how we resolve disputes without resorting to violence. Courts are the branch of government that is entrusted to preserve the fundamental governmental institutions that are created by our constitutions, whether it's the Canadian, US, or Michigan. In particular, the courts enforce a separation of powers, and we know that power corrupts. So it's the court's job to ensure that no one branch gets so much power that it becomes authoritarian. The court that I work for in particular, it has an obligation to represent all 10 million people of the state of Michigan with all the majesty and dignity of the law according to each person individually. It's just kind of a fundamental precept of the courts, both in Canada and the United States, that everyone gets treated equally. And I know that's in theory, that's true with the other branches, but realistically, if I, Dan Brubaker, write the governor of Michigan or my federal or state senator, and I say, hey, I'd like to have lunch, maybe talk about an issue, I'm not going to get a call back. On the other hand, if I was extremely politically well connected, or if I was a wealthy donor, or I was a CEO of a major corporation, I probably would get a call back. It's just understood that not everyone is going to be treated equally, but that's not true in the court system. In the court system, if I walk into a courtroom and I, Dan Brubaker, go sit at the plaintiff's table, and a very politically well connected, heavy donor CEO goes and sits at the defendant table, the judge is going to treat us equally. We're going to get equal time. And the judge is going to decide who's right or wrong based on the law and based on whatever facts we're presenting. And it's not going to be about how much power I have. And the courts are the most, in my mind, the most egalitarian branch of government. And I would also have to say just that, so having been with the court over 20 years, I really appreciate the justices. They're smart people. They're dedicated public servants. They really care for the state of Michigan and the law of the state of Michigan. And again, kind of unlike the other branches, I think the justices talk to each other. Again, they come from a wide political spectrum, and you would expect conservative justices to rule consistent with their conservative judicial philosophy, just like progressive justices tend to rule consistent with their progressive judicial philosophy. But when they're sitting at the table, they talk to each other and they listen to each other. And it happens all the time where a justice will come in intending to take position A in a case, and then they hear another justice talk and they say, you know what, you're right. I was going to do this, but you've convinced me. I think we should do that. And I just don't think you see that as much in the other branches. So that's all I really wanted to say about my job. If you have any questions, I'll hold on to them just for a minute, because I want to tell you about two people in my family who are important to me. The first is Herbert Brubacher. So Herb was born August 20th, 1907 in Toledo, Ohio. Soon after he was born, the family moved to Lulu, Michigan, which is this rural area halfway between Detroit and Toledo. It was Herb's father, George Arnold, who moved from Herzl, Switzerland in 1873 when he was only 10 years old. George originally moved to upstate New York, and then found his way to Toledo, where he had 12 children. Herb was the youngest of those children, and would turn out to be the only one to graduate from high school or college. Times were kind of tough. So Herb and he had 12 kids on the farm. So Herb was kind of loaned out to the farmer next door who didn't have any kids. And Herb didn't like that arrangement very much because he had to work extremely hard. And apparently that other farmer wasn't particularly nice. But he did like Sunday mornings, because Sunday mornings he got off and he got to go to the local Methodist church. And by all accounts, it turns out that Herb liked church a little more than he liked working extremely hard on the farm. There were basically three pathways out of poverty for someone like him back in those days. And it was the church, the armed forces, or business. And he chose the church. So with the support of a rural ministry, he went to Albion College, which is a small Methodist college in southern Michigan, where he studied to be a pastor. And while he was there, he was kind of mentored by the president of the college, who had been a former missionary and really helped shape Herb's theology. While he was there, Herb married Helen Miller, a flapper, who was in the first year of teaching at a one-room schoolhouse. And so Herb actually served a couple of churches, rural churches, while he was at Albion. And between doing that and then her teaching, he got through Albion College and then went on to get a Bachelor of Divinity degree at Garrett Seminary in Northwestern University, and that was in 1937. He became a Methodist minister in Blissfield, Michigan, which is also kind of a rural farming community in southeastern Michigan. He was known as a vocal and sometimes very controversial civil rights advocate, who wasn't afraid to speak his mind, even if it created controversy. He was also a pacifist, which wasn't real popular with his congregations during World War II and the armed conflicts that followed it. He eventually wound up in Trenton, Michigan, and the parsonage for that church was right on the Detroit River, right across from the parsonage was Grosse Ile, and that's a small island that separates the United States side of the border from kind of the southern Windsor area of the border. And from all accounts, Herb's kids like to watch the pole and oar boats move up and down the river during the day, and they'd listen to the foghorns at night. Herb eventually became a district superintendent for the Methodist Church, which is kind of like mid or upper level management. You can ask my mom about it. She's also a Methodist minister and a district superintendent. So I'm going to leave Herb there for a minute. I'm going to tell you about Alejandro. Alejandro was born in Mexico City on March 12, 1977. He was born 2 months prematurely, and he actually started entering the world in the elevator to the delivery room. There was not a dad in the picture, so he was raised by his mom and her family. Alex's mom was only 15 when he was born, but she came from a family of very educated women, and they wanted to be sure that Alex's mom was going to continue with her own education. One aunt in particular helped provide funds for daycare and private schooling for Alex. Alex's mom did continue with her education and eventually graduated from the National School of Anthropology and History in Mexico City with a degree in archaeology. That meant she was off on digs quite a lot of the time, but the whole family pitched in and everyone made sure that Alex was taken care of. In the summer of 1987, Alex's mom introduced him to a young man who was working on a dig with her just outside Mexico City, and she let him know that they were dating. That August, after the dig was concluded, Alex and his mom visited the young man at his home in Michigan. His mother and her very, very handsome gringo boyfriend spent some times on digs in Mexico City, or around Mexico City, and in southern Mexico, until 1988, at which point Alex's life was totally upended when his mom announced they were moving to Michigan. So Alex was only 11. He had to leave his family, his friends, his culture, his language, start a new home in a new country in Michigan. His mother married her gringo boyfriend when they got to Michigan, and shortly thereafter he adopted Alex. I don't know if you know this, but when someone is adopted, they get issued a new birth certificate. And Alex's birth certificate reads Alejandro Brubacher. Herb was at the wedding when his grandson Dan married Alejandro's mom, and even helped officiate, so Herb became Alex's great-grandfather. Alex, by the way, would go on to play soccer and wrestle at Lowell High School. One of Alex's good buddies owned a dairy farm, so Alex spent a lot of time working on that dairy farm. And I'm not sure if he was any more of a fan of that than his great grandfather Herb was. He then had, so Alex now owns a computer animation company in Virginia Beach, lives on Chesapeake Bay. And I wanted to tell you about Herb and Alex for a couple of reasons. You know, first, it's as we talk about the stories of the Brubaker immigrants, it really hits home to me. It feels very real watching my wife and my son leave everything. Communication is much better these days than it was when a lot of our ancestors come over, but watching them leave everything, start fresh in a new country, it takes a lot and it's not easy. It's hard. So I get that. And I think about like my great grandfather, George Arnold. He was 10 when he came over. Alex was 11. It's not easy. Second, I wanted to tell you about kind of what's special about my Brubaker family. So both my parents, so my dad was Bob, was Herb's eldest son. And then my Aunt Betty Jo, who was Herb's daughter, adopted interracially way back in the 1960s. So I was fortunate enough to grow up in a racially mixed family. And then through the process of marriage and kids being born, the diversity grew in my generation, but particularly grew in the next generation. So for my kids, growing up as a Brubaker actually meant having Black and Latino and white siblings and aunts and uncles and cousins and parents. And we really love that our family kind of reflects the beauty of God's diverse creation. It's that aspect of who we are is very meaningful to us. I'm proud, I'm very proud of my grandfather, our Swiss ancestors. And I am proud and inspired by my children and my grandchildren. They really give me hope for the future. I wanted to tell you about it because they're not just my family, they're your family too. So thank you very much for having me and allowing for me to speak here today. Does anyone have any questions?
I had one to start was well, we also were getting people muted. What's the most difficult part of the job, would you say? And I can even chime in because you talked a little bit about some of the partisanship.
Yeah.
And I imagine avoiding accusation that you're playing any favorite or acting on behalf of anything other than best interest, right?
Yeah, I couldn't do my job if any of the justices thought that I was partial to the other justices' points of view, political points of view. I mean, I have to, in order for the justices to be able to trust and rely on what I'm telling them, they have to understand that I'm coming at it from a neutral legal perspective, you know, not as a conservative or a liberal. I'm just, saying what the law at this point requires. If they want to change the law, they're welcome to change the law, but that's not up to me.
So how do you feel when someone doesn't believe that? How do you handle that? That's what I'm wondering, if that's the because we have a number of Brubakers I know. I say we, I'm married in public service or politics, and I just have to imagine that must be so frustrating.
Well, so publicly, I don't really take political positions. Like,
Yeah.
I do a lot on Facebook, but it's all like jokes about my family and things like that. I don't want it to be perceived by the public or the justices as having a kind of particular agenda, because I think that would negatively impact what I do. I haven't really had a situation where a justice thought, we have had justices who kind of thought the commissioner's office leaned one way or another, but I've never had a justice question me specifically or suggest that maybe I was allowing my own political view of something to kind of leak into, any recommendation I was making.
You had to work hard at that, though.
Yeah. You have to be able to relate well to people from across the spectrum, and maybe that's something that Brubakers kind of do well. You have to, and I really do it. And I have friends who are very conservative, and I have friends who are very liberal, and particularly in the court, you don't you respect people and you respect their points of view. You don't assume someone is unintelligent or has some kind of a hidden agenda. It's kind of a mutual respect for everyone's opinion and their humanity. Really, the hardest part of my job is just making sure I'm prepared, because you would think that after 20 years, we would have, I would have it down, right? And that there would be very few situations that would arise where I would say, I've never seen this before. But like the one where we had the petition circulating, signature company committing fraud. We hadn't seen that before. So you get these cases all the time, and where you just haven't seen it before, and and it's my job to tell the justices, here's the procedure for handling this, and here's how I think here's what I think the best way to deal with this. Not the ultimate decision. The justices always make the ultimate decision, but I have to say, here are your options. Here's the timing for when we have to get something done, and and make some sort of recommendation as to, at least procedurally, as to how we ought to go about it. And that, and just being prepared for the conferences, because you never know when a question is going to come. I can read a report 3 times, and I'll get to a conference and justice will ask a question, and it just, for whatever reason, I didn't see it in the report, or I didn't read a footnote or something. And you just never want to be unprepared in front of the justice. Yes.
Do you think it's possible to actually really be an original?
That's a hard one.
The question was about being an originalist. Is it even possible?
Yeah, we just had 2 justices kind of debate that in an opinion, where one justice was saying, no, look, we have to know what the original intent of the drafters was with respect to the specific issue. The other justice was the Chief Justice, in response was kind of saying, well, we don't know that the original intent of the drafters was to always decide things by the original intent. It's possible that when they drafted this Constitution, they thought it would be kind of a living document that would need to reflect new changes to society. So it's a kind of a hot debate. I think it's always difficult to determine the either legislative intent, or like in Michigan, we had a constitutional convention in 1963 when we adopted the Constitution. And it's hard to know what the specific intent of the ratifiers was, because it's a large body. It's the same thing when the legislature passes a statute and you're trying to figure out what is the legislative intent of the statute. Well, the legislature is not one person, it's a bunch of people. And so it can be difficult. I can't really take a position on whether originalism is a good legal theory or not, because it is.
They're not mentioned anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like pure strict originalism would be very hard to. But typically we are aware, when the court is looking at a case and you're trying to figure out how the statute applies or the Constitution applies in a specific situation, you're kind of trying to figure out, well, what did they mean when they wrote this? So it's an element of the kind of the judicial inquiry.
Ken, I think it's on. Ken, I think that's on. It should be on.
Yeah, I totally get that. Yeah. Yeah.
This question here.
Sure. Yep.
Someone?
My question is not very guys.
Actually, not.
What's interesting to me is these and the state level, the people person.
No, it can happen, yeah. So especially in criminal cases, for instance, but once we render, if we deny leave to appeal in a case, or in the rare instance where we would like affirm a conviction or something, The defendant could appeal directly to the U.S. Supreme Court. Very little chance that the U.S. Supreme Court would ever take that case. They have discretionary review, just like the Michigan Supreme Court. But what they can do is what's called file a federal habeas action in the federal district court. So that's one path. And what they would be saying is the state courts have deprived me of my federal constitutional rights. So that's one way you could get into a federal court. Typically, though, when an attorney is filing a case, the attorney has to decide, is this a state case or is it a federal case? Or are there elements of both? Attorneys can do what's called forum shopping, which you might look at the state system and think that, right now the state system is very conservative. I need a liberal jury, so I'm going to go to the federal system, or vice versa. So you can kind of play around with that. The courts don't do that favorably, but you, as an attorney, that's kind of one of the things you figure out. It's, you want to know where to file to best benefit your client. Yes, sir.
You mentioned in the word 1812. Detroit fell off the British rule.
Yes.
Okay, how long was it under British rule? Was 1812 not the border between the U.S. and Britain and Canada?
It was the British trying to recapture the United States, while trying to bring the United States back under British rule. I don't think Canada was officially a part of it. It's my understanding what happened in Detroit was that the general that was at the fort in Detroit got tricked into thinking that he was surrounded and that he was vastly outnumbered, when in fact he had far more troops in the garrison at the fort in Detroit than there were enemies. But he was scared, and so he just surrendered. I don't know how long Detroit was under British rule. I don't think it was very long. There wasn't a whole lot of action in Detroit, actually, because they quickly, the British took it, and then I think there was more going on kind of in northern Michigan around Fort Mackinac, in that area. I'm not a history buff on 1812. I just know that it's not a great chapter in U.S. military history, the giving up of Detroit without firing a shot. Turns out our forces vastly outnumbered the enemy, but we didn't realize it.
This time it's on.
This is not a question for you, but may I share your genealogy?
Yeah, I know that was mentioned when I came up, but so the geology that was put together for me was,
Yeah.
well, you can go, you know more about it than I do, frankly. It was put together by my grandfather, Herb, and then my uncle Dale.
I'll go use this mic. Yeah, I remember, when did you connect with us? About 6 months ago, was it? Anyhow, we had an interesting conversation. I'm not sure how much was email and how much was verbal, but I know Dan asked something about, is there a chance that we might be related? I said, well, what's your name? And I said, we're definitely related. There's no question about that. He said, oh, I doubt that. He said, well, you have to go back pretty far. I said, well, that might be the case, but I'll bet you again. So he sends the genealogy of your great-grandfather, I believe, got in Herzl, which Herzl is on the west side of Lake Zurich. And just an FYI, if you go to Switzerland today and you say, look, I'm a Brubaker, where are they from? Most Swiss would say Zurich or Zollikon. Zollikon is really next to Zurich, on the east side of Lake Zurich. Well, our roots, of course, start there also, but our roots are somewhat rebels, and they were in the Anabaptist movement. And so Brubacher crossed from the east to the west side, where the Anabaptist activity was going very strong in that area. And so then he gave me his list, and it goes back to Yulee. And Yulee is married to Hans Landis, the last person that was persecuted by being beheaded in 1614, I think, or 1615. His wife was Margaret. And sure enough, and none of those of you that are into genealogy as much as others, but there was a publication in Lancaster County Historical Society back in, it was in 1992. Jane Evans did a wonderful job of doing the genealogy study of the Brubaker Feinstock throughout the United States. And it was really beautiful. So I went into there and sure enough, there was Julie, there was Margaret, and that was in his genealogy. So I sent an email back. I said, sure, one of us, whether you think you are or not. So he was part of the rebel part. And I think, I mean, tell me, well, my understanding is he is the first person that Layton has run across who goes back that far as connected. Most of the people were connected with, we talk about Peter, the second Peter, and his offspring in this country, probably 95% of not more go back to Peter. And Yuli would be a nephew to Peter. So we are very closely related. So you are in the Brubaker shop, fan shop. What do you think so?
The funny thing is, like, I don't even know exactly why, because they weren't Anabaptists and they weren't being persecuted. I don't know why my Brubaker ancestors left Switzerland. Unless like they did something really bad and they had to get out of there. So, 1873. And then they went to New York, so they must have, yeah. So they must have known someone in New York at the time, but that's where they went, and then, but then quickly moved to Toledo. It's kind of a weird thing to do your genealogy and discover that your ancestral roots are in Toledo, Ohio. Spent a lot of time there. Sir, did anyone else have any questions or anything? Okay, thank you again. Thank you so much for having me. Okay, wow. That's going to be a process. Okay, well, thanks, Dan, so much. That was an amazing insight into the inner workings of our judicial system. Thank you very much for sharing that. That was extremely interesting, and certainly Michigan is I'm sure it mirrors many other states in how that whole process functions. So I think we can all sort of should be able to relate very closely to that example, those examples. Okay, so well, that's our first day. We're off and running. Tomorrow is a big day for some speakers. So I'm looking forward to seeing everyone back here again. And our online folks, we're going to be starting here at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. So make sure you tune in online. And everyone else, we expect to see you here tomorrow morning. Also, just a reminder that you can find out more information about our Brubaker Families of America